Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Mark Twain famously quoted British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. He said, "There are three kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics." But there's a fourth kind of lie now: Biden administration climate math. In this video, I'm going to discuss how the Biden administration is misinforming the public about wildfires. The fear of burning up causes a lot of terror, and the Biden administration wants people to believe that if they keep using fossil fuels, they're likely to burn up. In order for the Biden administration to frighten the public like this, they have to hide a lot of information. This is a graph which the EPA has recently put up on their website. It shows wildfire extent in the United States from 1983 to 2020. 1983 wasn't very long ago, and it came after the first 207 years of U.S. history. In fact, Joe Biden had already been in Washington, D.C. for quite a while before the start of this graph. According to the EPA, the U.S. Forest Service had data from 1983 to 1997. And the National Interagency Fire Center had data from 1983 to the present. According to the NIFC data, wildfire extent in the United States has quadrupled from 40 years ago. On this graph, I've plotted the 5-year average of burn acreage since 1983 in red and atmospheric carbon dioxide in green. It looks like there's a pretty good correlation between atmospheric carbon dioxide and burn acreage. As CO2 has increased, so has the amount of burn acreage in the United States. This is what the Biden administration wants people to believe. They want people to be afraid that if they keep using fossil fuels, they're likely to burn up in a forest fire. That's a pretty scary thought. But now let's look at the data which the Biden administration is hiding. According to the EPA graph, the U.S. Forest Service only kept data from 1983 to 1997. I worked for the U.S. Forest Service as a wilderness ranger during the early 1980s, and I'm not convinced that the EPA's claims are accurate. Here's an article from the New York Times dated October 9, 1938. Forest fires, one every 3 minutes in 1937, burned almost 22 million acres. Every 3 minutes on the average during 1937, a forest fire started in the United States, but this year's total of losses was considerably under that of 1936. The Forest Service of the Department of Agriculture reported today that 185,209 forest fires last year burned almost 22 million acres of timber. The number of fires in 1937 was 18% less than in the previous year, while the burned acreage in 1937 was only slightly more than half of the acreage burned in 1936. So in 1937, almost 22 million acres burned, and in 1936 it was closer to 40 million acres. And this data is from the U.S. Forest Service of the Department of Agriculture. So why is the Biden administration saying that the Forest Service only has data from 1983 to 1997? And let's look at the total burn acreage which they're talking about. They're claiming that 2020 was a record with about 10 million acres burned. But in 1937 there was more than twice as much burn acreage, and in 1936 it was about 4 times as much as last year. The last time Joe Biden was in the White House 10 years ago, the U.S. Forest Service published this report. And the report included this graph of burn acreage from the U.S. Forest Service. Let's take a look at this graph. It shows that the lowest year for burn acreage in the United States was 1983, and that burn acreage was much higher prior to the 1960s. The New York Times reported 22 million acres burned in 1937, which you can see right here, and more than 40 million acres burned in 1936, which you can also see on the graph. So the Biden administration is hiding all of this inconvenient data prior to 1983, which shows that their premise is incorrect. They want people to believe that burn acreage correlates with carbon dioxide. But if we look at the complete data set, we can see that there's no truth to that concept. Burn acreage is actually down 80% in the United States as carbon dioxide has risen over the past century. The Biden administration wants you to believe that the start of the data set is right here so that they can make a fake correlation between CO2 and burn acreage. But this story actually gets much worse. They're not only hiding data, but they're also deleting it. According to the EPA, the National Interagency Fire Center data begins in 1983. And if we go to the National Interagency Fire Center website, we can see the same thing. They say they have data from 1983 to 2020. But the same website showed something completely different on January 29th of this year. This is what the same website looked like 4 months ago. They had data all the way back to 1926, which showed that burn acreage was much higher in the past. In 1930, more than 50 million acres burned in the United States, which was 5 times higher than last year's claimed record. In fact, every year prior to 1951 had more burn acreage than last year's supposed record. Also note that this table precisely agrees with what the New York Times reported in 1938 about the burn acreage in 1937 and 1936. So sometime since January, the Biden administration has deleted all of this critically important data. This story is pretty horrific, but it actually gets much worse, as I'm about to show you. Let's go back now to 1910, when the largest forest fire in U.S. history occurred. About 3 million acres burned up along the border of Montana and Idaho in about 48 hours, and most of that burned in about 6 hours. This fire was unlike anything we've experienced in the past 110 years. The red areas on this map show what burned up on August 20th and 21st, 1910. The green areas show national forest lands, so you can see that a pretty large percentage of the national forest burned up in just 48 hours. The United States experienced record heat and drought during the year 1910. March of 1910 was by far the warmest March on record in the U.S. The average maximum temperature during March 1910 in the United States was 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Almost 2/3 of days were above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and almost 40% of days were above 70 degrees. Accompanying the very warm temperatures was extreme drought. March of 1910 was by far the driest on record, with U.S. stations averaging less than 1 inch of rain. So the stage was set for the massive fires of August 1910, which were unlike anything we've seen recently. Now let's go back a few years earlier to February of 1898. Shortly after Valentine's Day of 1898, huge forest fires occurred in South Carolina. Almost 3 million acres burned once again in just 2 days. Again, this was unlike anything we've seen in recent years, and this occurred during February. Later that summer came massive fires in the upper Midwest and in Colorado. According to the New York Times, during September 1898, fires covered almost the entire northwest part of Colorado. The Fort Collins, Colorado newspaper said that fires were covering all parts of the state. These fires were much larger than the claimed record fires in Colorado last year. Now let's go back a few years earlier to 1890. During May of 1890, there was fire everywhere in the Northwest, which meant states like Minnesota and Wisconsin. And by June, there were massive forest fires in Colorado and New Mexico as well. These fires burned up where I used to work as a wilderness ranger during the 1980s. The massive aspen groves north of Santa Fe, New Mexico are there because of the 1890 fire. The fire burned out the pine trees and made room for the aspen trees to grow. In fact, some types of trees like lodgepole pine, which dominates the forests of Wyoming, can't exist without large forest fires. The seeds won't germinate until a large fire occurs. Forests need fire. It's an essential part of the forest cycle. And all of the fire suppression we've been doing over the past 80 years has been very harmful to our forests. The Smokey the Bear propaganda campaign was one of the worst things which ever happened to U.S. forests. Now let's go back 150 years to October of 1871. New York Times, October 7, 1871. Prairies in flames. 150 miles swept by fire. Men, women, and children fleeing for their lives from the St. Paul, Minnesota Pioneer. The Chicago Tribune reported the same thing on October 7, 1871. And the following day, the city of Chicago also burned to the ground. But that actually wasn't the worst fire of October 8, 1871. Fires burned all around the Great Lakes, and Wisconsin actually got the worst of the damage. Much of the region around Green Bay, Wisconsin was destroyed, and the city of Peshtigo was hit the hardest. People were leaving church that Sunday, and without any warning, a massive firestorm came out of the sky and killed more than 1,000 residents of Peshtigo. To get a feel for how hot that fire was, people tried to take refuge in water wells and many were found boiled to death, and some people were found with melted coins in their pocket. Many cities, including Chicago and Peshtigo, were burned up around Lake Michigan and Lake Huron that day. But the Biden administration wants people to believe that we don't know anything about fires prior to 1983. This story about the Biden administration hiding information is pretty horrific, but the story actually gets worse. This is another government report which has been deleted by the Biden administration. It used to be on the National Interagency Fire Center website until a few months ago. It said, in the conterminous United States during the pre-industrial period from 1500 to 1800, an average of 145 million acres burned annually. Today only 14 million acres are burned annually by wildland fire from all ignition sources. What this report is saying is that 10 times as many acres burned in the United States when carbon dioxide levels were below 300 parts per million. There is no correlation between carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and burn acreage. Quite the opposite, in fact. The Biden administration wants you to believe that last year's 10 million acres was a record, when in fact it's actually below the long-term average. This webpage has been deleted, and now if you go there, this is what you see. The National Interagency Fire Center is committed to making its information and communication technologies accessible to individuals with disabilities. But what they're actually doing is they're hiding critical information from everybody with or without disabilities. The disability we have is the Biden administration itself. They have formed a task force to ensure that scientific decisions are free from political influence, which means, of course, the exact opposite. What they're actually doing is making sure that political decisions are done without any interference from actual science. And they're actively deleting all science which interferes with their political agenda. A few years ago, Governor Jerry Brown of California said that fire fueling heat worse than civilization emerged 10,000 years ago. Democrat politicians like to make up scientific information, and when they're not making it up, they're simply erasing it. People aren't comfortable believing that government is lying to them or that they're ruled by criminals. So many people will simply close their eyes and ears and believe the outrageous lies which politicians are telling them. This video was just about forest fire data, but the climate fraud from the Biden administration goes far beyond fires, and I'll be discussing more about that later. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this racketeering operation for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Kyrie on the web at realclimatescience.com.